You should be seeing us live on YouTube in a couple seconds. I'm going to wait for it to finish setting up, and then I'm going to close out that screen so that I'm not hearing myself twice. Okay, so we are now live on YouTube. Andy, can you find that?
Oh, yeah, I see it here. Okay.
Okay, great, great. So, hi and welcome. We've got a few people joining us early, and we'll have more joining us in a bit. If any of our early attendees would like to go ahead and share your camera, let us know, and we'll promote you to panelist. Otherwise, it's just us. But welcome, Cynthia, Jayanth, Judy, and Justin. That's a lot of J's. We're glad everyone is with us. We are live streaming and we are recording. And we had about 80 people register. We'll see how many actually are able to join us live. And so, Emily, you had some power issues. If you have the chance and you would like to send us the PowerPoint, if your power goes out again, you can join us by phone and we'll share your PowerPoint for you.
No, I have a perfectly good generator.
Okay.
That is fine, and it will, everything will continue to work. And hopefully, if it goes off, the problem will be if I have another carbon monoxide warning, then I'm not going to be able to keep teaching. So we'll just see how things go, but it should be good.
Thrilling times we live in. We're all familiar with power outages down here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I'm aware. Both my parents live in Texas.
Oh, were they okay? Did they lose power for long?
They lost power for a while. My dad had no running water for a day or two. It was exciting.
Yeah. Yep. Well, welcome everyone. We're so glad that all of you are joining us. Feel free to start chatting now. Enter your questions, comments in the chat box. We're delighted to have all of you with us along with our speakers. We're going to be starting in just another minute or two. And we're delighted to have all of you with us. And it's about that time. While people are joining us, I am going to go ahead and start a poll. So while people are joining us, please go ahead and let us know whether you have written about your science before. We've got multiple options here, things that you can enter in the chat box as well. So please go ahead and vote. Have you written about your science before? Have you shared it with the public or with other scientists? A number of us are getting ready for the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference that's coming up very quickly. But the deadline for submitting our videos and our initial posters at least is passed. So I'm hoping that people have the chance to breathe for this week.
You did?
So while everyone is joining us, we're going to go ahead and give you 5 more seconds to finish answering the poll question. 5 more seconds to finish answering the poll question. And if you joined by just the computer without actually going through the Zoom program, you might not be able to see the poll question. I apologize for that. The question is, have you written about your science before? And your choices are, no, I haven't had the opportunity, or I've only done it for other scientists, or I've written blogs about my science for the public. I've written articles about my science for the public. I've written books about my science for the public, and other options. And for those of you who have selected other, please do feel free to enter your thoughts in the chat or enter your thoughts about other topics now too. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and thank you so much for your responses. It looks like a lot of you about almost half of you have written blogs before. Great. About a third of you have only written for other scientists. And a fifth of you haven't had the opportunity at all. We're glad to have all of you with us today, and we're delighted to have you join us for this presentation. Sherelle, can we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? So I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers for today that are with us for our Sharing Planetary Science seminar. Emily Lakdawala, she's actually appeared with us before a couple of times, and she's an excellent science communicator and educator, and is well known for sharing about planetary science. Martin Radcliffe is also extremely well known as an astronomy educator, owner of planetarium domes, science writer, contributing editor, and so we're delighted to have all of them with us. I'm going to ask a poll now, just for a second, to let us see a little bit more about you. So let's go ahead and who have you written for? We'll go ahead and let everybody share who they have written for if you've written before. And while people are entering their poll answers, Emily and Martin, before each of you starts your presentations, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background in terms of why people should write for the public, why this is important. What do you think?
Well, since most of us, I think, or most of the people who are watching this are probably funded by the public, I think it's only right and proper to give back by explaining some of what you're working on, but also in helping the public to understand the scientific process a little bit better so that they understand why that kind of work is necessary in general. Science education is not always the best in this country because educators generally at grade school levels are often not trained to be science teachers. They come into science teaching from an education background, and it can be a struggle to, especially at lower grade school levels, to get the proper training in place to get teachers comfortable with teaching the scientific process to the public. And so there's a lot that I think the public doesn't understand about science, and it's really great when people can not only explain what we learned through the scientific process, but also explain how the process works and what its strengths and weaknesses are and why people are so excited about it. So those are certainly the reasons that I do it.
Thank you.
And I would add, if I may, the inspirational side of it. Any time I'm writing something, I'm not only trying to explain what is happening or what, particularly with Astronomy Magazine, what people can see on their own from their own backyard, but to make it more accessible to a very broad audience, and B, to really provide the inspiration to both encourage people to either go out and take a look or go on the internet and explore and learn under their own devices. It's surprising how many people, well, it's not surprising really, you know, a lot of people have a mental block to science. Oh, that's, I mean, literally above their heads, right? With astronomy, and it really isn't. And I like being able to open that door to people to say, in a simple way, say, no, you can actually go outside and see Mars tonight next to the Seven Sisters. It's right there. And by the way, there's a rover just landed on it, and it's real and it's live, and you can connect to it that way. And I think trying to provide that live connection to the night sky, to things that are really happening. And one of the things I do as another part-time job is teach at Wichita State University. And I teach an intro astronomy course where I get students from all kinds of backgrounds, from music, from theater, from engineering, from, you know, very many from science. But what I'm trying to do is enable them to find astronomy very accessible academically, and make it not this kind of ivory tower type thing where there's too much mathematics that usually frightens everybody off, but open it up to people so they can readily understand it.
Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and let's stop showing our slides. And Emily, let's please have you start off with your slides whenever you are ready.
Okay, is everybody seeing my slides? You can just give me a thumbs up. Okay, very good. So I'm going to talk with you today about effective written communication to non-specialist audiences, techniques for acquiring and maintaining reader engagement to encourage knowledge acquisition. Or if you have edited your text more correctly, you'll get something more like how to grab a reader's brain and teach them a thing or two. The point is that the style of writing for the public is extremely different than the style you have learned writing for academic audiences. I spent only 2 years in the academy. I left after acquiring a master's degree, and it took about 2 years for my editor at the Planetary Society to train me out of the style of writing that I'd learned there. And so what I'm going to talk with you about in my short presentation will be the writing process that I've developed that's been working for me. It may not be the one that works for you, but this is generally how I approach writing, and also usually how I offer advice to people who are who send articles for editing. So some of you may be familiar with the presentations I've given before on how to how to prepare a better conference talk. And I tell people to begin their conference talk preparation process by asking themselves 5 questions about who their audience is, what you want them to learn, how you're going to tell the story of your work, how long you have to speak, and what visuals will help you tell your story, with visuals being the last thing, my point being that you prepare your PowerPoint presentation as the very last step of talk preparation. The process of writing an article is pretty similar. So the first question you should always ask yourself is, who is your audience? And the reason that you need to ask that question is because it guides not only the level of language that you can learn, that you can use in your writing, but also the level of context you're going to need to provide them in order for them to understand it. You need to ask what you want them to learn, what sort of article you're writing, what the word limit is, and then again, at the very end of the process, you get to the visuals that will help you tell your story. To expand on these a little bit, let's talk first about who the readers are. You need to think about their age, the education level that they bring to their reading. You also need to ask yourself, are they coming here to read my article because they're already fans of space and space exploration? Or are they a more general audience, like people who might show up at a museum or would read a newspaper? If you're going to be doing a lot of writing for the public, I strongly recommend checking out the National Academy's science education standards, because those will give you guides as to what kind of context you can expect people to come to your article with. And remember that newspapers in general are geared toward readability for people who have somewhere between a 5th and 8th grade education. And looking at science education standards, I think that assuming a 5th, 8th grade level of comfort with science education standards is probably not a bad place to start. So for instance, for Earth and space science, at a younger level, like 2nd grade, the kinds of things you can expect a kid at that age to know or to be taught is that the sun rises and the sun sets, and rhythms you can watch every day, and they're not the same time every day. And by observing, you can discover patterns, and you can actually predict what's going to happen in the future. That's a 2nd grade level. At 5th grade, you start learning about the objects that are in the solar system and about things like annual orbits and those kinds of rhythms and patterns and how things relate to each other. It's not until 8th grade that kids are expected to understand how things like tides work and why the tilt of the axis of the planet leads to seasons in the way that it does. And in fact, a lot of people in the general public haven't thought about since lower school probably, or don't recall, the reason that seasons work the way they do is because of the tilt of the axis of Earth, as opposed to the changing Earth's distance from the sun. So I think the science education standards really help set a framework for you to understand what your readers can be expected to come to your article with. Now, if your readers are more of a space fan bent, for instance, if you're writing for like Sky and Telescope magazine, then obviously you can assume a much greater comfort with the basics of the night sky and the solar system, but they still may not know what active missions are operating right now, or about how the latest advances in adaptive optics have completely changed the way that we're able to observe planets in our solar system. So you just need to set the stage and make sure that your article will be comprehensible to an audience by providing enough context for them to get the point that you're going to be teaching them or describing to them later. Then you need to ask yourself what you want your readers to learn by the time they're done reading your article. And that goes way beyond facts. You may be writing the article in order to explain some scientific facts or something like that, but remember that by participating and communicating with the public, you also really need to educate the public about the scientific process, how science works, how we ask questions, and then we identify ways that we can go about doing experiments or observations to seek answers to those questions. And that along the way, it can be fun, it can be inspiring, it can be frustrating, that the whole process is worth being passionate about. When I'm talking to more youthful audiences, I'm very careful to emphasize the fact that scientists do not have all the answers. In fact, if we did, there'd be no more science to do. And I love to emphasize the questions that we're still asking, and then to point out to kids that if they become scientists, those are the kinds of questions that they will get to try to answer. And that's one of the great things about space science, is that these questions are so easy to understand. Things like, why is Venus different from Earth? And did Mars ever have life? But kids at the age of 8 can understand those questions. And the fact that we don't have those answers yet is I think, a great motivator to kids to say, hey, look, there's lots of mysteries out there for you to still explore. So at the end here, I suggest that if you think about the question, if people were to only take one thing away from your article, what would you want that to be? And then write that down at the top of your document. Make sure that you're leading to that or building to that, or that you're driving that point home as you write your article. You also need to think about the style of the article. Each of these types of articles that I've got here, news, encyclopedia entry, a feature, an explainer, a personal blog, or answering a question, each of them has a different style to it. And one of the main things you need to ask yourself is, what is the point of view and the voice going to be? You can either do like a third person point of view or a first person point of view. I've edited a lot of articles where people write about things in the third person for most of the article, and then they start talking about, I did X, Y, and Z toward the end. And let me tell you, it's a bummer to edit point of view, to change voice all through an article to make it match the end, or vice versa. So you need to make that choice right at the beginning. And then it's important to establish what the word limit is. These are less important for personal blogs than they are for like news magazines or whatever. But word limits are very important. Magazines absolutely have to stick to word limits because they only pay for pages with advertising space. There's a hard limit to the number of pages that you get. And so I aim, when I'm writing, to write about 25% more words than the word limit in my first draft, because I can always cut, and cutting is an important part of the editorial process. When it comes to visuals, if you're writing for a magazine or a newspaper, often you may not even have any role in picking the images. The editors may ask you for some suggestions and you can provide them, but usually the photo editor, the illustration editor is different from the copy editor who you'll be working with. And while you probably will get a chance to offer feedback, and sometimes you work very closely with an editor to illustrate your article, you don't always. So definitely don't waste your time on figures until you've gotten at least to the second draft of your article. So here's a quick overview of my writing process. So the first draft is getting words on the screen by any means necessary. It's probably terrible. Your first draft is going to be awful, and that's okay. Writing in general is a process of trying not to hate what you're writing while you're writing it. And then you get your first draft on the screen, and then you can edit. Edit is always easier than writing. If there's some fact that you're not sure about, like some date or whatever, Generally don't bother looking it up while you're writing. Just put data in brackets and keep going. Just get those words down on the screen and you can fill in some of those gaps later. You may find you don't need to fill them in because you're going to cut that paragraph anyway. So don't get sidetracked on those tiny details, just write. In the first edit, then, I go and I fix the structure and the organization. So when you are writing for the public, it's really important to have an engaging first paragraph that kind of lays out why this topic is interesting to the reader. It should intrigue them, engage them, and also give them a little bit of a preview of what they're going to get if they bother spending the time to read the rest of the article. And so when you're a very experienced writer, you might be able to write this first paragraph when you start writing your article, but generally speaking, you don't get that first paragraph straight out. You have to do that on your first edit. You find the meat of your first paragraph and you put that up front. And then I go through and I chop my very long paragraphs, because academics love writing long paragraphs. I chop them into much smaller mini articles that each stand on their own. And then often I rearrange the heck out of them until they make an arc that makes sort of a storyline sense to me, so that things are in a logical order. If I find things that don't seem to fit into that storyline, that's a good candidate for something I can cut because it's extraneous to the story. And so you'd wind up ordering your paragraphs into an order that makes sense, and then make sure that those paragraphs really do stand on their own. That facilitates skimming. So if somebody, is not going to bother to read your whole 3,000 word article, they can skip down paragraph to paragraph until they find something that intrigues them, and then they can read in more detail. In the next edit, that's when I actually start wordsmithing. Academics love to load down sentences with lots and lots and lots of dependent clauses that modify the sense of what they're saying. So you need to split those long sentences into shorter ones, both to make it easier to read and understand, and to make it more interesting to read and understand. It gives the words on the page more rhythm if there's more kind of arcing from one sentence to another. It's fine to have a mix of short and long sentences. You can really affect the rhythm by which readers read your text that way. But it's generally worthwhile to chop almost all of your sentences into multiple pieces. You can also cut unnecessary clauses. You don't need to have all of the hemming and hawing that you typically do in an academic paper. It helps reader comprehension if you replace your its and this and those other kinds of pronouns with the nouns that they refer to. And often you'll find out as you're doing this that you've messed up some subject-verb agreement, or you've messed up some other kind of syntax that makes it difficult to understand what you're talking about. So replacing pronouns with nouns can help comprehension. Replace any jargon that you can. If you don't need the jargon word, replace it with something that's that you don't need to teach your readers. If you absolutely have to use a jargon word, and you may need to, make sure you define it very clearly, and then make sure that you use it multiple times in different contexts to help teach the reader that word so that they can retain it and understand its use. Go through and change as many instances of passive voice to active voice as you can. That again means finding the subjects of your sentences and finding more interesting verbs to use. Replace polysyllabic Latinate words with shorter, oomphier ones if you can. And just cut anything that isn't strictly necessary to convey the point of what you're trying to say. Now, you don't need to do quite as much of this polishing if you're doing like a stream of consciousness sort of blog type thing. It may be more fun to have your wandering language and that kind of thing. But when you're writing for a more formal kind of environment, like a magazine article or something like that, then cut anything that's extraneous to the point of your article. On my third edit, I like to read my article aloud, and that helps me identify awkward places or places where I don't understand how to read a sentence because maybe I've lost track of my subject and I have too many dependent clauses. And this is the point where often is where I finally kill some phrases that I was really attached to, but I may have felt very clever writing them, but they really don't help readers to understand what I'm writing. And so I go ahead and I cut those, have a moment of silence, and then I keep going. And then finally, if at all possible, I like to just close the document and let it stew overnight, at least, in order to come at it fresh another day and see if with a fresh perspective, I notice anything that is awkward or difficult to understand, or a place where maybe a reorganization is going to help lead from point A to point B more effectively. And then I do a final read and I send it on to my editor. And so speaking of editors, editors are your friends. They know what they are doing. They will make your words much more easy to comprehend. Don't be alarmed by the amount of red ink you may see come back from an editor. Usually it's just designed to rearrange subjects and verbs, rearrange a couple sentences to make things easier for the reader to understand. Of course, you can argue with your editors, but pick your battles, pick the important things. Don't argue too much about word choices, just let them have it and go for the more important struggles that you feel more strongly about because they actually affect the science story that you're telling. So that's my process, and I guess I'll hand it over to Martin at this point.
Okay, so just go full screen. Thank you, Emily. And what I'm going to talk about initially is just where I come from for my background, because I'm not a formally trained science writer or editor. I'm actually more, well, I was trained a bit in astronomy, but spent most of my career in the planetarium world. And before I forget it, I want to pull up a point that Emily made, was about the images being last. One of the things in the planetarium world, because it's a visual medium, is the images often come first, and you write to the pace of the visual. And so that's writing a planetarium show is a very different animal than writing an article. So I'm going to be talking about writing articles, but I'll tell you that's kind of where I come from as a visual storyteller. And it's probably why I find writing actually quite difficult. But I do it every month just to keep going. I'm a contributing editor at Astronomy Magazine, as Christine introduced me to. What that means is I'm not on staff. It means I get paid for my article, and that's all I do. I send it off to an editor, and my wonderful editor makes me sound really good. And so that's, I take as a benefit, very similar to Emily. I write, at least 25, 30% more words than they're going to use. So I thought it'd be interesting to say, how did I start out? I never considered myself a good writer when I was a teenager growing up. My teachers drummed into me that I was terrible. And so I had this difficulty of getting started in writing. And so what I did was, at a local astronomy club in England, I started a newsletter. And this was in the 1970s. So we were typing this newsletter onto pieces of paper and then copying them on a drum machine, a very old style, feels like the 1800s almost. And so that got me writing, because I was always interested in doing it. And so after a while, once I graduated in astronomy and then joined the Armagh Planetarium in Northern Ireland, where I spent 7 years, Astronomy Now was a new magazine in the UK, and Patrick Moore had started that, and he was already writing the night sky column. And it turned out my planetarium experience was ideally set for writing about the night sky, because I had to do it live every day for an audience. And so Patrick approached me to take over his column, which I was both incredibly flattered, rather surprised, and then realized, well, if he thinks I can do it, clearly I can. And so that's really where I got the motivation, in a way, to start writing a monthly column. So I did that for a number of years until I moved to the USA, and I got invited to take over Astronomy Magazine's Night Sky column. It had been written for about 10 years by one person, and I couldn't imagine writing it for 10 years. It just seemed incredible to me, and that was 25 years ago, and I'm still writing. In fact, it's due tomorrow. So it's interesting. Be careful what you wish for, because you can actually end up writing a long time. I also wrote occasional articles, and you see these are quite old. I did a news article for New Scientist when Voyager 2 flew by Neptune, which is one of those major science interplanetary missions that really drew everybody's attention, rather like the Mars Perseverance landing did nearly a couple of weeks ago. And then I also got an opportunity working in the planetarium again in the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh. We had an observatory on the roof that was remotely controlled. And so I had an editor at Sky and Telescope who visited, saying, would I write an article on this new idea of controlling telescopes and imaging over the internet? The internet was very new in the mid-90s, and very few people were doing it. So I used a telescope on Mount Wilson from my office in Pittsburgh, and I invited school kids in, and then I wrote up a whole article about the experience. So it was a really very interesting thing. But I do want to emphasize, probably unlike Emily, writing is not my main job. I have day jobs sometimes, and so writing is something I do as a side thing to my main thing, and that's probably what happens with scientists. It won't be your main job, and so you have to find ways to improve and think about your writing. This is just a copy of the current issue of Astronomy magazine, and you see I do the night sky column with a colleague in Canada called Alistair Ling. Both of us classify ourselves as amateur astronomers, but we also attend professional astronomy research meetings like the LPSC conference that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And so being able to have that dialogue between scientists and the technical jargon that we use at conferences, and translating that into something that's approachable and reachable by a broad audience, is one of the skills that I think is critical to develop and critical to think about as you're writing. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things that way. How about getting started? If you're a young scientist and you're a postdoc or a postgrad, and you think that you also want to write, certainly start writing in some way. Create your own blog, create a compelling article for a newsletter or a periodical. Maybe it's at your university, and maybe it is for astronomy or Sky and Telescope magazine or some other. Learn tips from writing about planetary science for public audiences from others who are good at it. Of course, we have Emily, who is excellent at it, and there are many others as well. And be clear about what your audience is. I'm a little bit overlapping with what Emily has said, so I won't dwell on that, but do be clear. Are you writing for kids? Are you writing for adults? Are you writing for a technical adult audience, which tends to be the Sky and Telescope style and astronomy style audience? If you really want to stay technical, think about writing for Astrobytes, which is a wonderful online magazine, if you like, that is written by postgrads and postdocs for other scientists to read. And the reason for something like Astrobytes is you may be the world's greatest expert in conglomerates on Mars, but somebody who is studying the atmospheric circulation of Jupiter has no clue about conglomerates on Mars, even though you're both planetary scientists. And so this is a way to convey your research to a technical audience that actually does know what you're talking about, but you need to add a little bit more ground explanation about that. Also, watch your language. I use this headline when I talk to even students, but particularly at academic conferences. We're familiar with those conversations that happen at academic conferences, and they're very different conversations to how the public understands or reads or converses. So phrases such as, this data is consistent with theory X, will become, in the public's mind, this data confirms theory X. And so you have to be very careful in how you're going to translate that. And this is really about conveying the scientific process, that we don't know all the answers. And you have to try and explain clearly how we get to those answers. And sometimes having something that's consistent with a theory or a model is not always the right answer. And scientists are very careful not to be too confident. But you've got to balance that with a little bit of confidence, I think, in a way, so as not to muddy the waters. If you're writing, ask rhetorical questions in the text. That's a really good thing. You know, what does this mean to planetary scientists that we have a rover on Mars? And don't start answering the question as you would at a live academic conferences with the word "so." That doesn't work. That will get edited out. So that's a little bit of a inside joke there. Use quotes from other scientists. It really brings the text alive and immediate, makes it kind of first person as well, which makes it a very dynamic for the reader. And simplify your word choices. Write very concisely. Use a passive or active voice as appropriate. And again, Emily has made some very good points on that. The challenges of speculation, and I use this as an example. If you have a paper that shows evidence of cometary and protoplanetary objects causing random and seemingly inexplicable changes in brightness of a star, at the end of the paper, if you mention that the data is also consistent with alien megastructures, be careful, because that last comment will become the headline and go viral. And this, of course, I think everybody knows the story about Tabby's star. And a recent article, well, it's a couple of years old now, was that Tabby's star dips in brightness so bizarre. Could it be we found ET? No, not yet. It's dust we see. And that's a very clever article by well-known science writer Nadia Drake in National Geographic. And in fact, dust can be used to explain many things in astrophysics and in planetary science, as we well know, having just landed on Mars. I've got a short list of kind of science writers that you can follow and read. Most of them are on Twitter. They also have, I was also going to add, science writing is a profession. It's a notable profession. There are degrees in science writing that you can take. Read some of the best science writers' articles, and I've got some good examples here. Camille Carlisle, a Sky and Telescope, has an astrophysics background. Nadia Drake is also a PhD, writes at National Geographic. Alex Whitsey is at Nature. Victoria Jaggard is at National Geographic. Dan Cleary, of course, at Science, and of course, Emily. So these are people, you know, that I enjoy reading and try and learn some techniques from how their style works well and why they are good at it, and then try and emulate some of that. Take advice on board. This is a quote I found from Jim Austin in Science Magazine at the AAAS website. Advanced scientific training can actually work against you when you're writing. In some ways, scientific training is poor preparation for a career as a science writer. The problem is, of course, that science is usually practiced and communicated in a language that is too narrow for the audience that we're writing for. As a scientist, you learn to care deeply about the tiny details that general readers care little about. And even scientists working in related fields may not find the details of your work compelling, and that was my reference to earlier about you know, conglomerates on Mars and an atmospheric scientist on Jupiter. They're really in very different areas. So that's really a very quick review of some of my thoughts that I had. A couple of other just general thoughts I don't have a slide for, but I think all of us at some stage in our careers are affected by what's popularly known as imposter syndrome. You think you're not going to be very good at it. I never thought I was very good at science writing, to be honest, even when I had articles in a magazine. I thought, well, you know, at least I'm getting something in print. And it wasn't until I started hearing anecdotally from distant people who had apparently read my article and they had gone out and done something based on that article. I went, wow, okay, this is actually having an effect and this is wonderful. So I never hear from readers. In fact, that's one, I don't know how, Emily, you probably hear more from your readers because you're on Twitter a lot and some feedback. But I generally don't hear from readers unless I know them, and they're typically planetarium colleagues. But those comments, you have to know that, you have to trust that people are reading your stuff and valuing it. And that's sometimes an unknown. And of course, we've become more familiar with that in this COVID world where we're all remote anyway, so we're not meeting people to talk about those things. So that's where I'll probably end it there and pass it back to you, Christine.
Well, that actually connects quite nicely to Paul's question that Emily said that she'd answer. And so Emily, I'll let you start on that. And then if you have any other things to say, Martin, please do so. But Emily, how do you get feedback on how to improve?
So, yeah, it's a especially important question for me because as somebody with ADD, there's something called rejection sensitive dysphoria, where if you don't get feedback, you assume that everybody hates your work. So it's really important to get feedback, or else I'm sure that my work is terrible. And so, again, I will say editors are your friends. You know, professional editors that you work with are in the business of judging the quality of writing and also making your writing better. So whenever you have the opportunity to work with an editor, seek feedback from them, you know, and you may not be able to do that in the rush of preparing an article for publication, but afterwards, if you ask for advice, and also if you just look at the way that they edit your work and you extrapolate from that to try to understand what it was they were changing, why they were making the changes that they make, then that helps you improve your writing. When I first started working at the Planetary Society, when I started working there, my first editor was Charlene Anderson, who had edited Jacques Cousteau and Carl Sagan before me. And so she had lots of excellent input and also lots of funny stories about editing them. And so she was a fantastic teacher for me and really helped me develop my ability to write for the public. So yeah, seek feedback from editors because that's really useful. Analyze the feedback they sent you. I was writing some things down here. Oh, and yeah, write and speak and otherwise do engage different kinds of audiences, because you may find that you learn lessons in one arena that you can then take to a different one that help you write better in that other arena. So it helps to have a diverse variety of audiences to be speaking to or writing for, and then it feeds back into the other kinds of work that you do.
Thank you. Martin, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, not particularly. That was great.
I wanted to follow up on a couple of things that Martin talked about Martin, when you said when you're talking about watch your language, I think that in addition to the kinds of stuff that we tend to take for granted in science conversation, things like the difference between a hypothesis and a theory, there's also an awful lot of words that have a very specific meaning to a scientist, and it has a very different meaning to the general public. And one of the ones I like to point out is rock. As a geologist, when I talk about a rock, I usually am thinking about a rock formation that has an origin and has some extent because it formed at a certain time. So it also has an age. It has a way it was generated. All of those things are in my head when I use the word rock. And of course, a member of the general public thinks about something you can pick up off the ground and throw into a lake. It's not the same concept at all. So you have to watch for words like that you may not even realize mean something different to you than they mean to your audience. Sand is another good one. There's all kinds of words like this. There's a great article that was written by Sarah Hurst for the Planetary Society on what haze means. Because she writes about Titan's atmosphere. And she was actually motivated to write this article because even among scientists, people don't seem to agree on what they mean when they talk about haze. And so she defined it, and this is actually a neat story, she defined it for this article that she wrote for the Planetary Society blog. And I think it was Nature or maybe Science came to her and said, hey, would you write that up as an article for our magazine? Because it's obviously an issue in the scientific community. So writing for the public can actually get you back in front of scientific audiences as an authority on how to be more clear about your science.
Awesome. Great points. Great points. I am going to close down the poll that I started in about 5 seconds. So anybody who hasn't voted and wants to, you've got 5 seconds left to finish voting. 4, 3, 2, 1. And so here's what people said their preferences are for writing for the public. Martin, do you have any feedback on these in terms of what you think of in terms of priorities?
That's a very interesting display because I actually decided to answer this as well myself, and I didn't use keep it simple and avoid and remove technical details because for one specific reason. I like using technical details, but I'm very careful about how you introduce them. So again, it's thinking about your audience. So, every month I'm writing about, Jupiter's rising in the southeast. And I try and do that poetically and differently every month because otherwise it's going to get pretty dry. And but when I talk about things like magnitude or phase, phase for a planet is very interesting. And I've noticed, it's actually my editor that taught me this, was I was constantly writing, Venus has a 57% phase, and it was always being changed to 57% lit, which is actually much more explanatory to everybody, including me. And so I just intuitively know what phase means when it comes to a planet because I learned it as a kid, but not everybody does that. And not everybody has looked through a telescope either. So when I'm writing about viewing the planets through a telescope, I try and be very careful about how to view through a telescope, how to view a planet through a telescope. So for example, and again, it's practical knowledge. If you have been to a star party and the public are looking through a telescope and they go, oh, there's Jupiter, and then they move away and they've been there about 5 seconds, they've missed all the belts on Jupiter because they haven't given their eye time to get used to it. So I try and include some details like that. So in a way, it's adding technical details, but in a helpful way. I love colorful descriptions. I really try and do that. And I do try and avoid acronyms if at all possible. And also try and use the active tense. I think that makes it a more lively, and I smiled when Emily made this comment earlier about, oh, how terrible it is as an editor when somebody writes something in one tense and then flips to another. I know that I'm terrible for that because when I go into my second edit, I go, oh, good grief. So I try and do some of that myself before I send it to my editor, but I know that I am very bad at doing that, and it's something to look out for. And then including an overarching picture. So in my column for Astronomy Magazine, the way this comes about, and Emily touched on this as well, about writing your first paragraph. I never write my first paragraph until I've finished, because I want that first paragraph to be engaging the reader who might pick the magazine up on a newsstand in a grocery store, and they go, oh, what? And often my article is where the thing falls open at the first page, and I want to be able to grab them immediately in that first paragraph that they scan read to say, you can go out and see Jupiter tonight. You can go out and see the rings of Saturn tonight. And they may not think that that's possible, and they go, oh, that sounds interesting, and they'll hopefully take the magazine home on the basis of having read something like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sherelle, can you go ahead and go to the next slide? And Emily, do you have, and the slide after that? Actually, back to our folks. And we're going to take a couple of questions from all of our participants. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat, or if you want us to unmute you, go ahead and maybe raise your hand, and I will come and find you and unmute you so you can talk yourselves as well. So who has a question that they would like? Oh, I see. There's questions in the Q&A section, which is great. So thank you, Paul, for that. Can either of, Emily, can you please expand on the difference between passive and active voice, and when it might be more appropriate to use one or the other, but the difference on there?
Well, the rule of thumb is that if you can insert the phrase by zombies into your sentence and it still makes sense, then what you've got is passive voice. So for instance, these were discovered in 1980 by Voyager. These were discovered in 1980 by zombies. That is, if you can do that and the sentence still makes some kind of sense, that's passive voice. So instead you want to reorder your sentence so that you can say Voyager flew past Jupiter in 1980, discovering or imaging or whatever. Try to make switch your is verbs into more active verbs. I also wanted to follow up something that Martin said, and also looking at this poll about the keeping it simple and removing technical details, which I completely disagree with. I think that one of the reasons that you want scientists to do writing for the public instead of just journalists is that scientists know those more complex and technical details that readers often find really interesting, as long as they're explained in a way that they can comprehend. And this is one reason why I really like to write articles with that kind of the ordered set of mini paragraph structure, because my goal is to write an article that's of interest to many levels of reader. And so usually the first sentence of each of my paragraphs is something that pretty much everybody can understand. And then as I get down into more details, I actually feed people more technical detail, more insight, more unusual things that you might not read on any other website. And then keeping in mind the fact that maybe I've gotten a little too far down on in the weeds for some of my readers, the beginning of the next paragraph will be a moment of clarity for everybody and can help bring people forward. And so you can skim my article just reading the first line of every paragraph and you can still get the gist, or you can dive down into all the details. And so I kind of have this feeling that it's kind of a sawtooth sort of structure to the complexity of the writing, where it's simpler at first, but then you start explaining the nuances as you get down into the paragraph, and it just keeps on kind of a wave-like that is sort of the shape of the writing that I do.
Awesome. And there's a comment here from Cynthia about that she often finds a lack of reading comprehension occurs when she's working to produce press releases, and that other writers might twist what is stated or miss the main point or upend the whole story. And this happened today. So any recommendations on how to ensure that the press release is clear, that it doesn't get misinterpreted by others?
I think it's impossible to write a press release that can't be misinterpreted, but I think you do have to be very careful to avoid, to recognize the fact that as soon as you mention things like life and organics and things like that, you're going to get people very excited. So you have to be very clear at the outset, both what you are announcing and also what you're not announcing. To be clear, this does not prove or even indicate the existence of life on Mars in the past. But it's I don't know how you hem and haw about whatever. It depends on what your discovery that you're touting is. I think, I don't tend to write those kinds of stories myself. I do have a lot of friends who are extremely responsible journalists. And I think that part of the challenge of writing press releases is that you're trying to write sales, you're trying to market something to make people want to write about it. So you have to punch it up a little bit, but you also have to not punch it up so much that you make people write misleading stuff. I think it can help a lot to have a scientist not involved in the study provide a quote for an article, because that kind of helps make your press release a bit more trustworthy in terms of having a voice that could be dissenting or that has a slightly varying opinion on the significance of a discovery. I think it makes it easier for a journalist who doesn't know so much about that topic to be able to understand the nuances in what you're writing about. So I always really appreciate press releases that include either a dissenting voice or a person outside, not connected with the study voice, to help prevent some of that overexcited interpretation of press releases.
Thank you. I wanted to give all of our attendees a couple of seconds to think about applying what you've learned and what you already know. So I've taken something and I have changed it in a way that it is no longer as good as it was originally written. What are some ways for all of our attendees? Please enter in the chat. What's a change what's a word that you might change here? A word that you might remove? A phrase that you might improve? Are there any passive sentences here that perhaps could be improved in this particular paragraph that has been Justin, yes. And please enter when you share your things in the chat, please share them to all attendees as well as panelists. Yes, please change protoplanet. That is a jargon. Not everybody knows what a protoplanet is. So depending on who you're writing it for, if you're writing it for a science savvy audience, maybe it might be okay. But for the general public, protoplanet is definitely jargon. Any other words that you might change or phrases that might need a little bit of rewriting that anyone wants to point out? Incapable of retaining, change it to unable to retain. I like that. Or break up the text in shorter sentences. And mention where Vesta is, give them some context, that's great. Water mobilized material. That phrase, I don't know what the best phrase is, and if there's a better one, but that one I keep sticking on. Water mobilized flows. Water mobilized flows to me sounds like flushing the toilet. So I would wonder if maybe there might be something else that could be used there. Gullies on Vesta may have been created by flowing water. Awesome. I like that. Asteroid, water mobilized materials, maybe something about sand or dust or what the materials are, something more descriptive there. Material moved by water. Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to give you a chance to practice and to think about it a little bit. And we've got a couple more of these. I want to do one more really quickly. Oh, before we go to the next slide though, Martin, Emily, do you have any feedback on this particular paragraph? Any thoughts?
My initial thought on this was you have two very long sentences. And so I would definitely, I agree with, I think it was it Robert, or forgive me, I've forgotten your name, it's gone off. Yeah, you need a short sentence in there to make it a little more interesting, and then changing the last sentence, which is very passive, change some of the words, make it a little more dynamic.
I have a problem with the whole concept of water in space. The way that scientists think about water in space is not all how the public thinks about it. And so I would provide a lot more context about what we mean by water. And I don't even know, reading this, whether it's talking about, was it water ice that is now liquid flowing water? Was it water retained in the microscopic structures of minerals? What is the state of water that we're talking about? When we say water mobilized material, is it like a river? Is it a mud? What is the state of the material? How fast did it flow? Did it flow just once and stop? I have so many questions about what is meant by the water. The other thing is, whenever I read, and of course, this is just the opening paragraph of something, so one would hope that it would be, a lot would be expanded on in the rest of the press release. But another question I always have are, what are the alternative hypotheses? Or are there any other places where anything like this has ever been seen? Is this the first time this kind of thing has been suggested ever? Or is there context for this? Is Vesta the only asteroid where we've ever seen water before? Because everybody's excited about water on Mars. And so there's so much contextual information that it can be a little overwhelming to think of how long that list is, but including as much context as possible will prevent people from completely misinterpreting what's being said in this press release.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And Gavin had shared with the panelists a revised first sentence. The NASA spacecraft Dawn visited the asteroid Vesta from 2011 to 2013. Maybe there could be a period there, maybe it just continues, and discovered that there is evidence water could be stable on the surface for a short period. So
Why do we care? That's the other thing that I want to know. You
Why
know,
do we care?
is
Making
that important? Can we mine it? What is the reason that people ought to be excited about this, apart from the fact that as a scientist, I think it's very cool. But as a member of the public, why are we looking for water on Vesta? Does it matter for some resource development reason? No, it matters because it has to do with the minerals and the stories that we can learn from reading the rocks and the development of the solar system and where Vesta was, all these kinds of questions. You and I know what it is, why we care about this, but you actually have to explain why we're even studying this in the first place.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to move to the next slide. Thank you, Sherelle, so much for your help. I really appreciate it. And I've got another one here that, again, first of all, this one wasn't written to be like a public press release for the general public. And I also made some changes to make it not so great. What are some ways that this could be improved? I'm going to give everyone a chance to enter things in the chat. Are there words here that you would change or eliminate or replace? Are there phrases? Are there things that are fundamental that it really needs? What words do you really like in here? What aspects about it do you love? What things would you change? And we'll give everybody about 30 to 60 seconds to just look and think and read. And while you're reading it, are there words in there that need to be replaced? Are there words that are jargon? And if so, which ones? Which ones will most people outside of planetary scientists not be familiar with, outside of geologists and planetary scientists? Martin, are there words that you would like to see not there?
Yeah, I muted myself. I would pipe in the very first thing that I didn't like was the use of thereby. I just don't like that. It's very clumsy. Zircon grains, what are they? The fact that we have an investigation of a large Canadian impact crater, but the last sentence says that it was just obliterated soon after its formation. So how are we seeing anything there? So there's a disconnect between, the evidence of an impact, which can be there in the geological structures in that area that indicate an impact. What are they? How do they relate to the study they have here? That's a very brief, and the use of the geological time as well. Ordovician is certainly not well known in the general readership.
Right. Robert and Nandita, thank you for both pointing out.
It's worth pointing out that
Emily, please.
I think it's worth pointing out that we name eras in geologic history based on fossils. So a very easy substitution for Ordovicianist time is when toothy fishes ruled the seas or something like, I forget what exactly the fossils are. I'm not a paleontologist, but that's an easy substitution to make because that's how we define those eras. For me, I see this as a missed opportunity. There's a great story here underneath the words. And so I think I would put a story in front about the faraway collision causing this major bombardment of asteroids hitting Earth and causing scars that have lasted for 500 million years. And then, talking about the scientific study after that. That's an exciting story right there.
Thank you so much. And yeah, Doug also suggested you could simplify it to tell the story, to tell the story. The story itself would be amazing. We are just about out of time, folks. Sherelle, can you move to the very, very last slide while I put up a final poll for all of our attendees? We would love to have your input to help us determine what works well from all of you and what you would like to see us do differently. Please join me in thanking Emily and Martin for their time. We so greatly appreciate it. And if anyone has further questions, you can still enter them in the chat box now. I'm going to give you like 1 more minute for any final questions while we take this final poll. This recording will eventually be available on our website, and I've also got a page of resources that we'll put there as well. So
I have on Twitter, one of my Twitter lists is a list of other science writers, and there's a lot of them on Twitter. It's very easy to engage with science journalists on Twitter, and they love scientists who engage them. So definitely feel free to follow them, read their articles, engage with them about how they tell their stories. And if you you can talk to them about the process of scientific storytelling, and they can answer lots of questions for you.
Well, that sounds great. That's a wonderful idea. I'm going to give everyone 5 more seconds to finish answering the poll questions here. 4, 3, 2, and 1. And we thank you for your feedback. We really do appreciate it. There's one last question here from Nandita. Are there detailed courses from either the Planetary Society or other forums to tone down jargon and write for the public and get feedback from folks? I know one of the sites that you might want to check out, the AGU site, their sharing science site has additional details on jargon that you might find useful, and they do workshops there. And of course, we do other Sharing Planetary Science seminars on what jargon was one of the things that we just covered recently. We can go ahead and repeat that one, but it's also available on our website. Emily, Martin, do you have other resources or other courses or places that you recommend people who want to learn more about that go to?
Check out the National Association of Science Writers. They have books on writing, it was more focused at science journalism, but it's a lot of the same issues. And also there's a website called the Open Notebook that has lots of resources for science journalists that could be useful for you guys.
Yeah, the Open Notebook is the one that I was immediately thinking of. It's very useful. And I think just what I said earlier, read what other people are writing. It's a very instructive. You may like it, you may not like some of it, and you'll see the different styles, and then try your own writing. And if you have difficulty writing, which all of us do actually, getting that the first few words down, and you think, well, this is going to take me 2 hours, and I don't want to spend 2 hours doing it. I'll spend 10 minutes doing it, and then go and do something else. And I find writing for 10 minutes is very easy. And what I find is I write for another 10 and another 10 and another 10. And it just accumulates that way. That gets you over that wall.
Awesome.
I do
Great.
find it necessary to protect my writing time so that I turn off Twitter and email and shut my door and tell my kids to bother me some other time. And I have to focus on writing for a little. I can do my research and preparation with interruptions, but once I'm writing, I really need to have focus time.
Awesome. Great feedback. And thank you both so very much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. I know our attendees did as well. And yeah, as Thomas said, this is great. Nandita as well said this was very helpful. Leah said thank you as well. And so did Claudia. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this hour. And I look forward to seeing your feedback as well. We have an open forum that you will receive when you leave this. And we'll see you in a future seminar. We're doing one on social media during LPSC. It'll be on Wednesday afternoon from the LPI booth. We'll have a webinar on using social media. We'll see you all in a couple of weeks at LPSC. Thank you all so much. And